Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at the effects of the Civil War, ultimately looking at the era that follows, that of Reconstruction, and beginning to look at Lincoln not just as a wartime president, which he was during his first administration, but also beginning to understand his mindset in the closing year of the war, that he was going to be the president of a nation that had come back together, and how to do that in such a way that the country could heal. Lincoln in 1864 wins a second term, and in March of 1865, he gives a second inaugural address. And at that time, he begins to speak about this idea that we must have malice toward none and charity for all. And speaking about the idea that even though we've been through a great civil war, we should not have bitterness. We cannot hate one another. We have to have forgiveness and be giving to one another. And that's how we're going to build a lasting peace. And so his vision was one in which he would be able to rebuild the country with time. Now, my picture here is the reason why Lincoln doesn't have that time. So the man in the upper portion of that crowd is John Wilkes Booth, who will be the man who will come to assassinate Lincoln. But the night following Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln comes out to speak to the crowd, and thousands of people come to listen to him, hear him speak. One of those people being John Wilkes Booth, who's planning within days to shoot the president and hopefully, in his mind, create some sort of coup and retroactively perhaps bring a victory for the South. But his second inaugural address is one in which he talks about the purpose of the war. He makes sure that the blame for the war lies not with him, because there were people who said that the war happened because he was not willing to let the South go. He reframes it as the war happened because the South chose to be belligerent over this issue about slavery. And again, also talking about this idea of peace. Within a month, we will see Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The army of the Confederacy is quite small. Robert E. Lee had about 20,000 men serving under him in the 2 weeks leading up to what was supposed to be a battle near Appomattox Courthouse. His men were marching anywhere from 20 to 40 miles a day, from train depot to train depot, hopefully finding supplies, and they did not. His men were starving, and he decided to seek peace. And this is the end of the war. There is no suing for peace on behalf of the Confederacy. We don't have a formal treaty to end this conflict. Literally, Grant agrees to take Lee's surrender and then says that any man who's been serving with General Lee, who has his own weapon, he can go home. Literally, people walked away. There weren't prisoners of war. There were those that were captured during the war itself, but even those people will be released. And so, in a sense, it was within days, it seemed like the country was in this path to rebuild itself. 5 days after this surrender, John Wilkes Booth commits his terrible act at Ford's Theater. And the next day, Lincoln dies from his injuries. So the impact of the war is something that's important to note, because it's part of the reason why we will see some people seeking essentially revenge on the South. We will see others who will look at the sacrifice and believe that there's work that needs to continue to be done, much in the way that Lincoln invoked with the Gettysburg Address, that those men didn't die in vain. We go on and we change our Constitution and we do what is needed to bring about some level of equality in our country, regardless of race. But that impact of the war, nearly 500,000 people are wounded. The dead for the Union is over 350,000. For the Confederacy, more than 250,000. The cost was extreme. That's not a typo. The U.S. had spent 5 times what it had spent in all 80 years before the war just to pay the cost of this 4 years of war. They expanded executive power beyond what Lincoln did in terms of trying to revoke habeas corpus and his extension of freedom to enslave people in those states in insurrection, or what is known as the Emancipation Proclamation. We're also going to see that in this time period that we're going to have an IRS created, so this Internal Revenue Service, to collect income taxes, which is now a power that Congress believes it has. The SCOTUS will overturn that within 2 decades. But a lot of revenue, great cost, great loss of life, and it's going to make people question, how much more does the war have to go on? So one man's reconstruction or fulfilling the unspoken goals of Lincoln is going to be another man's continued war. The items you see on the screen here, these are all artifacts that are tied to one of the endeavors of the post-Civil War era, which is that of the Freedmen's Bureau. It's important to note that for most enslaved people, not only do they find themselves ostensibly with freedom, certainly by December of 1865 with the 13th Amendment, but they may have been separated from their families for most of their life. They don't have any type of money or savings to start a new life. Literacy was somewhere around 98-99% of enslaved people. And so you're going to see institutions like the Freedmen's Bureau come to be to try to rectify some of those issues. And these particular items on my screen were all attempts by individuals to find their loved ones. And sometimes all they had was a first name and the belief they'd been told by someone that their loved one had been sold off to South Carolina or Mississippi, but had no proof of that, but hoped by putting advertisements in newspapers they would be able to locate those people eventually. Our cartoon here is poking fun at Lincoln. He was known as a rail splitter because that was work he had done in his late teens, early 20s in order to support himself. But Lincoln's view was that he could bring the country back together with a pretty low threshold of compliance by the South. And Republicans, right, people in his own party began to kind of question, could you simply just sew these two fractured portions of the country together and be able to have a union that was mended? Or was the damage far more significant and going to require a whole different set of actions? Lincoln has a lot of unfinished plans. So he thought that the 13th Amendment was the natural extension of his Emancipation Proclamation. So we were going to have to amend the Constitution because of the Dred Scott decision. That 13th Amendment won't finally be proposed in both houses of Congress and then ratified until the end of 1865. So Lincoln will not actually see what he started come to fruition. But for some people, they felt that was enough. There were other people, and Lincoln probably was of this group as well, which he realized other things were going to happen. Honoring of citizenship rights and perhaps even extension of suffrage had to be a reality, and therefore Congress was going to have to do a lot more work. But Lincoln believed that the first step beyond freedom for all people and the end of slavery was that you were going to bring these 11 states that had seceded back by simply having 10% of their population swear loyalty, write a new constitution that prohibited slavery and prohibited secession in the future. And that you only needed 10% of the voters in 1860 to agree to this. And you could have members of Congress representing your state again. There were plenty of people within the Republican Party who believed the stakes had to be much higher. And then there were other people like Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president at the time of his death, who had been a Southern Democrat from Tennessee. He switches parties to become part of this Republican contingent that runs in 1864. He was not a wealthy man. He actually believed that slavery was wrong because it was detrimental to the value of white labor, but was an ardent racist and believed that people who were non-white were inferior, and did not believe that anyone who was African American would actually ever truly be a citizen. So you can begin to see that certainly the radicals in the Republican Party were going to have issue with Andrew Johnson's views if he was going to be the next president. So Abraham Lincoln doesn't get to see his plan come to fruition. Andrew Johnson isn't looking about bringing the country back together so much as actual punishment for what he felt was criminal action. He believed that people who had been part of the government that had seceded, that anybody who'd been a leader in the Confederate military as an officer, any white person who had more than $20,000 in assets, which would be close to $1 million worth today, that these people were the reason the war happened, and they should be disenfranchised and not allowed to participate in government. They were criminals, but they could be pardoned. And we will see over the course of 2 years, Andrew Johnson is going to have a list of nearly 20,000 people, most of whom he actually will pardon. So it will be vengeance, but very short-lived. And then we have this third group of people, our radical Republicans, who say we've got to go much further than just simply emancipation, but we've got to also see that at least half the white voting population of 1860 is willing to be on board to say they will never secede again, that they truly do honor the 13th Amendment. The Wade Davis bill never becomes a reality, it doesn't become a law, but these goals become the goals of radical Republicans and what they put forward starting in 1867 in what we begin to call radical Reconstruction. Why do we have to radically reconstruct the South? Well, because within 2 years of the Civil War, we see that local municipalities in the South and some states are beginning to create what we call black codes, which were much like the slave codes of old. And they're focusing on this idea of limiting movement, political participation, economic independence for African Americans. Some of it was, there was this fear that essentially the workers of the South were no longer going to be available, but the cotton economy still needed to be revived and was still going to be utilized. And so you see that many of the limitations that were put on people of color, number 3, no public meetings of Negroes or freedmen shall be allowed within the town. These are ultimately being created in the same way that African Americans who were enslaved were not allowed to participate in any kind of assembly before the Civil War. And this is going to be part of the reason that the radical Republicans say that Johnson's not looking about reconstructing the South, he's looking to punish certain individuals, and that there is this other work that has to be done. So the presidential reconstruction, if you want to call it that Andrew Johnson tries to engage in, is going to be one in which he extends amnesty to a great number of people who he originally claimed deserved no forgiveness. Black codes are going to begin to pop up throughout the former states of the Confederacy. And the concern is by the group that's led by Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, the radical Republicans, that there may have to be some punishment of Confederates, but we also have to focus on this idea of promoting equality to freedmen. And they believe that Congress is going to have to be active in this process. Our 2 images here from Harper's Weekly, you can see Liberty looking a little different than we often see her today, but Confederates are attempting to beg her forgiveness. And there are people who say, well, you know what, this is what has to happen to build the country back again, that these people perhaps deserve pardons. Our cartoonist thinks that perhaps not, that the work that really needs to be done is that which helps African Americans, and in this case, our artist has deliberately chosen to depict a man who has made the ultimate sacrifice. He's lost a limb in the service of his country fighting during the Civil War, and that this is maybe what liberty's focus should be. But these plans for Reconstruction, we will see that between 1867 and 1876, this radical Republican plan is the one that's going to be implemented. It is the one that is going to change our Constitution 3 times. Johnson's plan, or what's sometimes called presidential Reconstruction, is going to be focused far more on punishment and not actually helping African Americans gain some semblance of equality. And obviously, as we've already stated, Lincoln's plan doesn't come to fruition because it simply doesn't seek to create enough change. When we compare presidential and congressional Reconstruction, obviously the leadership is different, but also it's important to see the amount of changes that take place. And that part of those changes simply are that there's going to be enforcement. About 20,000 federal troops are stationed in the South simply to make sure that these changes constitutionally and legally are honored. So radical Reconstruction is going to include refunding the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau was created by Lincoln and Congress in 1865, only to last for a year. But it was certainly seen that even as of 1866, 1867, there was still much more work that could be done, especially in terms of relocating family members, education, and any other general aid that might be needed by people who are just coming out of slavery. And so this Freedmen's Bureau Act required a lot of money. It was something that Andrew Johnson felt should not be part of the federal budget, so he overrode it, he vetoed it, and it was overridden by Congress. Andrew Johnson, over the course of 2 years, will spend a lot of time vetoing acts on the level of his long ago predecessor of the veto, Andrew Jackson. There will be enough Republicans in Congress that they will be able to have a 2/3 majority in which they can override these vetoes. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was to stipulate that African Americans were citizens. Yes, that's exactly what the 14th Amendment does, but the concern was that the process of ratification for the 14th Amendment might take a long time. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was intended for that purpose. Also overridden by Congress because it was vetoed by Andrew Johnson. And by 1867, the Republicans are going to create what they call the Reconstruction Acts, but they're going to take 10 of the former 11 states of the Confederacy. The Union Army occupied most of Tennessee, starting with the beginning of 1863. Their government, because they had a senator who never left called Andrew Johnson, this plan of Reconstruction did not impact Tennessee, but the other 10 states of the Confederacy will be divided up into military districts with military governors and federal troops and the U.S. Marshal's Office enforcing compliance. And again, we have some artwork to demonstrate what the Freedmen's Bureau offers for people of color who are now emancipated in the South. Certainly the opportunity for education. You can see there are children and adults learning to read and to write in this particular image on the right-hand side of our screen. On the left-hand side of the screen, we can see that we have a officer in the Union Army, and he is literally acting as the buffer. That many Southern whites saw that their power and authority was very quickly coming away at the seams, and often took their anger out on African Americans who they saw now rising in power and authority. And for people who questioned whether or not to keep funding, should we pay taxes year after year to keep the military occupation of the South, Reconstruction going on, our artist here says definitely yes. Without this man here, imagine the outcome of this scenario. Andrew Johnson's biggest problem was that he was not really a Southern Democrat. He had not joined his fellow Southerners when they chose to secede, including those in his own state of Tennessee. He also wasn't really a Republican. Yes, he ran with Lincoln in 1864, but he did not have Lincoln's vision, and he certainly didn't agree with the tenets of the more radical members of the Republican Party. And he saw himself as someone who could lead in his own right. Congress disagreed. Their attitude about the presidency, especially if you were a vice president who took over for a president who had died, was that you should continue operating in their stead. You should not go off on your own path. And so those people who were part of Lincoln's cabinet, who Lincoln had appointed, had been approved by the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate certainly felt that they'd given their stamp of approval on the Abraham Lincoln administration. And that was what Johnson needed to be running, not his own. And so Johnson begins to start firing people, including the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who agreed. He was a radical Republican himself and agreed with the military occupation of the South. And in trying to do that, Congress decided that they would pass something called the Tenure of Office Act, which later the Supreme Court will say is unconstitutional. But in its time, it stipulated that if you were a vice president who took over for an elected president, you could make no changes to those appointed positions unless those appointees resigned. You could not fire them. So in the act of trying to fire these people, including the Secretary of War, Andrew Johnson violated that. And he is impeached. We've had two other presidents besides Andrew Johnson be impeached. And what that really means is the House of Representatives believes there's enough evidence that you have committed some sort of high crime or misdemeanor, and essentially your impeachment is the charge against you. You then go face a trial run by the Senate. Andrew Johnson, William Clinton, and our current president all have been impeached. But as they have gone before the Senate each time has not voted to remove them from office. For Johnson, it was by a single vote. But he now will be a president in disgrace. He realizes he has no power. Anytime he will veto, he will be overridden. He cannot change his cabinet, and he becomes incredibly compliant and allows the radical Republicans to begin lead this process that they called radical Reconstruction. So as we end, just to be aware of Lincoln as he began his presidency in 1861 and how he had changed over time as he begins his second term. Granted, he only served about 5 weeks of that, but certainly where we see at the beginning of the war, the purpose was to bring the Union back together. Lincoln still wants to do that at the point of his second inaugural address, but he's also looking at the unfinished business. And so truly ending slavery and beginning to bring about a new nation. The Reconstruction plans, it's important to understand how Lincoln is different from Johnson and how Johnson is different from the radical Republicans. And what we see between 1867 and 1877 is transformative, although it will come to a very abrupt end after a decade. And then the last thing is to look at the positive and negative effects that came from the conflict between Johnson and the radical Republicans. By having a president who refused to address these issues of equality and citizenship, it created a circumstance in which the Republican Party was having to move well beyond where they were in the mid-1850s when they spoke about abolition and preventing the spread of slavery west, to now being the party of equality for all. And that is going to come at a price, because over time, the radical Republicans, as we'll see in the next lesson, could not maintain that enthusiasm and spirit. And after 10 years, much of their work will be very quickly undone as Reconstruction ends.